What's going on, guys? I was recently approached by an author called Andreas who'd just written a book on the London poker scene. In return for a bit of YouTube coaching, Andreas was going to publish an interview with me in his new book to give Carrot Corner a bit of exposure. So in this video, we review a few of the hands that Andreas has played at 50 Zoom on PokerStars. Things got off to quite a good start. At first, Andreas was taking quite kindly to my advice, and we were getting on rather well. Yep, a really reasonable thought process, I think. I'll just give you a bit of feedback on what I think about this. So,
as mainly a live player, this is quite a trivial fold in live poker.
Absolutely.
Most of the time.
Unfortunately, we then had a massive fallout. I guess Andreas didn't like the way I was giving the feedback so brutally and honestly, and began to push back in what I considered an irrational way. Before you knew it, things got very personal and heated, and we were tearing each other to shreds in this YouTube video. The argument was so horrible and violent that I almost decided not to publish this, but I want to show you what happened so you can decide who is in the right and who is in the wrong.
Really?
Of course, none of that happened. There's never any drama here at Carrot Corner. All we care about is the poker. We didn't fall out, we got on really well, Andreas is a lovely chap, but hey, maybe now more of you are still watching the video. If you believed my opening story there about the fallout, let me know in the comments. If you knew I was full of shit, also let me know. If you're tired of my silly shenanigans here on YouTube and you want something a bit more serious, then the Carrot Poker School is no joke. I spent the best part of a year creating and recording this content. There are over 33 hours of footage, 3 exams that you can take and watch corresponding feedback videos and homework tasks after every lecture. The Carrot Poker School is fully comprehensive, it's all the theory you're ever going to need. It's available for you at carrotcorner.com. Now let's get to this coaching session with poker author Andreas Wagner. Andreas, welcome to Carrot Corner Poker Education. Are you ready to have your game dissected?
Absolutely. Yes. Hi, Pete. Thank you for having me here. Let's go.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Maybe we can talk briefly just about how we know each other and how we got to the situation where we're doing this. So you are a poker author. You're writing, or you have written, I should say, a book about the London poker scene in particular, which I think is going to be really cool for a lot of our audience who are in the UK. So tell us a bit more about yourself. What's your sort of role within the poker industry? Tell us a bit about this book that you've written.
Yeah, so I started playing poker about 8 or 9 years ago, only a bit in my spare time. And then I hated losing at the beginning, so then I started digging a bit deeper into theory. Then about a year ago, I started taking it much more seriously, studying the game a lot more and playing a lot more as well. So I've been to all London casinos and traveled a bit around the UK and Europe and even Vegas, played a lot of live poker. And so I got to a stage where I knew so much about the venues and all sorts of things of live poker. And then I decided to write the London Poker Guide. So it's essentially a guide about all the venues in London. I have interviews with all the card room managers about innovations and what's going to happen in the future, but also interviews with all sorts of like poker tourists, for example, or coaches. And this is where we met. So I have a really great interview with Pete in my book. That's really worth checking out, where he talks about variants and about leagues that players have and so on. And so I have a few other interviews as well with mental health poker coach as well. And so yeah, I try to just talk about all sorts of topics that are relevant, mainly for live players, but also for online players.
Awesome. Any advice you would give to someone that was looking to start a career playing poker, live poker in London? Anything that is particularly interesting or that you found in your experience as someone who frequents that scene and has now written about it?
Yeah, so I mean, it really depends what you want and what your starting point is. There are casinos and card room for everyone, like whether you want to play 1-2, 1-3, 2-5, 5-10. Hold'em or PLO and so on. So it's hard to give one general answer. Also, it really depends how many hours you're willing to put in. But my main advice would be to just go out there, try one or two card rooms, and then see how it goes. Or actually, quite selfishly, just read the London Poker Guide.
Absolutely. So where can people get a hold of your book if they do want to know more about the London poker scene, and also check out that interview that we did together?
So I have two channels. One is basically myself. So I'm a regular in all the casinos, so just come and say hello. The other option is just a convenient one on Amazon. It's there for £15.99. And you can just find it under London Poker Guide and my name.
Awesome. Good to know. Okay, so we're going to get into some of these hands that you've played. We've put a filter on here looking at bigger pots mostly, but there is one hand from today that you've played that's really fresh in your memory, and that's this Ace Queen offsuit hand right here. These are hands played on 50 Zoom on PokerStars. So shall we get started, see what we can dig up here, see what leaks we can diagnose, and see how we can help your game?
Yeah, definitely.
Let's do it.
Go.
All right, so you've probably watched a lot of these videos before on Carrot Corner. What we like to do is replay the action a little bit and then come back and get your thoughts on it. So pre-flop here, we flat Ace Queen off out of the big blind against the hijack, which seems fine. We check call the flop. The turn is an ace.
No, sorry, I donked the flop.
We donk the flop. I missed that. I'm not used to people donking the flop, so very, very easy for that one to go over my head. Okay, yeah. So we donk the flop. Villain calls. Turn is an ace. We check. They bet big. We call. We check, and they overbet. Interesting decision. So I guess the first place to start here is on the flop with this flop donk bet. So what is your thought process here then?
Yeah, so it's just a range consideration here on 6-4-4. It hits me a bit better than him. I would want to bet for protection here with smaller pocket pairs, and also I have some monsters there. My hand, I was deliberating whether to donk bet this exact hand, but then I thought I could get called by a lot worse here, because he will probably float with all sorts of ace highs, possibly even king highs. So that was my reason for donking this exact hand.
Yeah, so I think already I'm kind of impressed by this reasoning. I think it's an element of the game that a lot of people understand that 6-4-4 is a really good board for the big blind's range here, but they don't take the next step of actually acting on that by building the donk bet range. So I know that when I face this, even at a game like 200 Zoom or something, I'm relatively surprised, because even some of the really good regs there aren't building that into their strategy for whatever reason. Maybe they just forget to do it, or they just are trying to simplify to checking. I think when we're against fish, there's no need to do this. Like when we connect hard with this board, fish are just c-betting far too often here, right? Like overall. Against regulars, I think these kind of plays work really well. As far as the question goes as to like whether you can do this with your exact two cards, originally I was kind of skeptical, but then you sort of convinced me. Like the way I talk about betting in the Carrot Poker School, especially on the earlier streets, is that there isn't just necessarily one reason for the bet. Obviously, on the river, you're going to either be value betting or you're going to be bluffing. Otherwise, you're making a polarization mistake, right? But earlier on in the hand, you can be betting for a mixed bag of reasons. There is some useful fold equity here, like if villain folds king 10 of diamonds or something. That's still like really useful to us. We're fine with that. They're folding out a decent amount of pot share. If we get called by something like ace jack, etc., that's quite good too. I would maybe just state that it's not so clear that getting called by worse here is always a good thing, because if you get peeled by 8-7 and then end up checking later, you do actually lose the pot to those hands out of position a decent amount of the time, even though they are technically worse hands than ace queen. But overall, I think between the value reason here and the protection reason, there's probably enough going on to make this bet all right. But I would certainly think if you're building a donk bet range, that this is a hand that gets into the strategy a bit less often, especially with the ace of diamonds rather than one of the other aces. But yeah, I think it's like not a blunder or anything like that at all. So villain calls, the ace of clubs comes in the turn. We decide to check. Any thoughts on this node here where we could bet or we could check?
Yeah, well, this was a bit where I was unsure, because I was just thinking a lot about ranges in this situation. So after I donked the flop, this ace doesn't really hit my range very hard, and this is why I decided to check here. Obviously, from a hand, it's great, but I thought in terms of ranges, I have to check this one.
Right, okay, so I think the way this would actually go in terms of ranges is that we could maybe talk about the overall range advantage as determining the bet frequency for your range, and then we could talk about like the composition of your value betting range as the factor that determines the bet sizing that you're likely to deploy if and when you bet, right? So I agree with you, this is a horrendous card for your range. Ace-X is definitely one of the combinations that A, you have less often than villain does just at the start of the hand when the flop first comes down, and B, as we've said, hands like Ace-10, Ace-Jack, these are going to be pure checks probably. Maybe Ace-Queen can start doing a little bit of value betting, as you said, or a bit of like value protection betting, as you said. But yeah, the ace is going to be a really big part of what the opponent just peels the flop donk bet with. They're going to be condensed in the direction of the ace upon making that call, and so this is a spot where your range wants to bet very infrequently. However, because you do have a monopoly on the 4x combos, and a rather large monopoly at that, what you can do here is build a very, very large infrequent bet into your strategy with 4x and select bluffs and otherwise check. That's the way I would go about range construction on this node, because range advantage determines your bet frequency, nut advantage or value region determines your bet sizing. It makes sense that you hardly ever want to bet, but it makes sense that when you do bet, you want to build it around trips and make it really big. Okay, so I agree with checking this hand. I think depending on what sizes you're building here, you could also bet this hand large as well. Like you could probably overbet ace queen as the bottom of the value range if you wanted, but I agree with almost always checking this particular candidate here in terms of what theory would want. Okay, so we check, we face this bet. I think a really easy call. I mean, we probably do technically have a value beater here. I don't know how familiar you are with like Carrot Poker School jargon, but would you recognize that term, value beater?
Yes, yeah, definitely. So I think I do have a value beater. I don't beat a lot of value, but I do beat some value. I think when he goes, what is it, 75% or so, he probably won't do this with ace 8 or so necessarily, but he can do it with ace jack, ace 10. So yeah, I do have a value beater.
I agree. So you have something between a bluff catcher and a really strong hand. You have some form of value beater. So that means that we're obviously never folding. Folding is totally out of the question. Raising feels too thin here. I don't see why we would ever do it. Yeah. And there's an exploitative reason why I don't want to raise here as well, but I don't want to give that away quite yet because I'd like to talk about it more on the river after I've heard your thought process. So we call, the river comes the 8 of clubs, and I don't know what you do against this bet, but we do face a bet of 25.78 big blinds. What is going on here? What was your thought process, and what did you ultimately decide to do against this overbet?
Yeah, I was surprised to see him overbet here, because I just couldn't really think what he would do this with. Like, okay, pocket aces, which we block, pocket sixes, or I don't even know. Yeah, maybe a 4, but with a backdoor flush coming in. So admittedly, I don't have a lot of flushes here. He shouldn't have a lot of them either, especially because the ace of clubs is there on the board. So I was really surprised to see the overbet there. I just don't know, like, but because I checked the turn and I don't have flushes or lots of flushes in my range, I thought he might do this with ace king plus yeah, some other monsters like aces, sixes, possibly a 4, although he barely has any, but also like the bluffs, I struggled a bit what the bluffs would be. I mean, he doesn't have, yeah, like 7-8. If he turns that into a bluff, I guess it's possible. But I really struggle to find a lot of bluffs here. And because of I condensed his range at least a little bit on the flop, then he bet the turn big and overbets the river. I thought I definitely only have a bluff catcher now, and I struggle to find bluffs, so I folded.
Yep, a really reasonable thought process, I think. I'll just give you a bit of feedback on what I think about this. So I think one thing we don't want to be too quick to do is to assume that villains' bluffs have to be some form of misdraw. That would be the case if we'd caused immense amounts of filtering, like had we donked the flop for pot, which would be a really weird thing to do, or had we double barreled and then they'd called. That's where I'm kind of like, well, wow, what are actually the bluffs here? It doesn't make much sense. I think we could maybe describe this flop action here as minimal filtering. We've bet small. Villain has probably peeled this with quite a lot of combos of like backdoor 2 overcards and things like that, as well as like some more straight draw stuff like 8-7 on rare occasions and things like that. I do agree that like the ace of clubs coming on the turn removes a lot of the unpaired hands, because obviously this is a card they're going to hit really frequently. So when it comes to the river here, I really do think that in GTO terms you just have a fairly bad bluff catcher, because I think the ace doesn't actually block very many value combos at all. I highly doubt pocket aces can ever go for an overbet on the river here. I think it would be going for a smaller sizing, blocking the hell out of your calling range against the overbet, and wanting to allow you to raise as a bluff more frequently. So I don't think aces, it's only one combo anyway. I think we can kind of forget about it. It really shouldn't be here for this sizing very often. A 4, yeah, okay. We do block ace 4 of diamonds, which is nice. That is one of villain's value combinations. That boat, it's a bit more reasonable to go for this sizing on the river with that. Other than that, there's 4 combos, right? There's like 4-5 suited and maybe king 4 sometimes, but yeah, very few 4x, as you say. 6s, a bit weird not to raise the flop with 6s. I would discount it quite heavily. Not fully, but like very heavily. And then the same with trips, actually. So to me, whenever I'm considering bluff catching, I go through a few different thought processes. The first thought process I go through is simply, I'm a station, I don't like to fold. Like, folding sucks, I'm going to call because I'm a station. That's my first thought process that I go through. Then I try and sweep that to the side and go through a bit of a more serious one. The second thought process I go through here is a threefold question. Part A of that question is, how much air does villain ostensibly arrive on this spot with? We call that the landing range in the Carrot Poker School, right? Like, how often do they get to the spot with combos that lack the showdown value to bluff if villain decides to then bluff them? The second question is, how wide is the value region? How many value hands are there? And the third question is, how natural is it to bluff for the aforementioned size if villain is holding air? So we kind of have those 3 questions. Now, on the air side of things, like how much air gets to this node, I think the answer is ostensibly quite a lot if villain is just peeling the flop really wide. Like, they could easily just have like all of the Jack 10 of hearts, all of the King 10 of spades, all of the Queen 10 of those suits as well. So the backdoor hands for sure. I guess the fact that the flush gets there does decrease a lot of that air because the clubs are obviously now flushes. So air, I think there's a decent amount, but not lots. Like something like that. I would give it like a 4 or 5 out of 10 to answer that question. Moving on to how wide the value range is, I guess I'm going to say this is mainly just flushes for value. I think there is like the odd boat in there as well. So the amount of value combinations that are possible here, I would think they are mostly flushes. Let's just sort of briefly go through what those could be. King Queen, King Jack, King 10, King 9, King 7, King 5, Queen Jack, Queen 10, Jack 10, Jack 9, 10, 9, about 10 to 15 combos of flushes, right? Something like that. Some combos of boats, and then the question is like how much of this air is actually getting here, and then choosing this bet size. So I think the third question, how intuitive is it for the player type that we see here, who is a reg, by the way? There's just almost no way this isn't a reg with this sizing scheme that we've seen here. I think it'd be very unlikely, even if you didn't know the player, it'd be very unlikely they were a fish or whatever. How intuitive is it for them to bluff with this sizing as played? I think it's quite intuitive, just based on the fact that your range looks fairly pocket pair heavy on this node, and it's going to be quite tough for you to call. So let's recap our answers here to this key question. The air is kind of coming in at like a 4 or 5 out of 10. There's not tons. The value is also coming in at like a 4 or 5. There's not tons, but there's a decent amount of flushes and stuff here. I don't think people will actually do this with Ace King very frequently at all, even if they technically maybe could just about scrape that sizing. I don't think they will. So let's say a 4 or 5 out of 10, and then how natural is it? It's fairly natural. Yeah, this looks really close to me. This looks super close. I think in GTO is the it's quite a big deal that you have the Queen of Hearts and not diamonds or clubs, and it's probably mostly just folding in GTO. I think the bluff catcher is like not very good, but I can see an argument for calling here based on the minimal filtering and based on how weak your range looks and how many value combos are available to the opponent. So I didn't want to just say, oh, this is close, because it sounds like a bit of a cop-out. So what I actually wanted to do was say, let's go through this procedural process, and then at the end of that, if all of our scores are like kind of mediocre scores, then probably it is close, right? But at least we've had some kind of metric with which to assess it.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting because I've been yo-yoing between calling too much and folding too much in these sort of spots, because as mainly a live player, this is quite a trivial fold in live poker.
Absolutely.
Most of the time. Then this is when I started playing online, I would fold these spots all the time. My red line plummeted. Then I went the other way. I started becoming a calling station to the point where my red line looks fine now, but now my blue line is plummeting because I've been calling too much. So now I'm just kind of trying to find the balance between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think another thing that really matters here as well is just, well, what is the stake you're playing? Who are the average players? Like, as you said, if you play this game at 1-2 live or even 2-5 live, you're going to get in situations where there are people who just only ever overbet when they're being greedy, when they have a value bet and don't have it in their arsenal to do this as a bluff. It's very common live for people who are recreational players, especially, to just never overbet bluff. And we know from data as well, harvested from online pools, that overbets from recreational players, even if the line is generally an overbluffed one, the overbet sends the bluff frequency through the floor. It sends it right down. So yeah, this is a spot where I think it's also really going to matter like what position you're against. See, if you're against like button here, I'm just way more optimistic about calling because there's so many more random hands that could have peeled the flop and then, you know, just not got there or whatever. Like they now have hands like the king 5 of spades they can peel with. They have a lot more of that. They might take one off with like the queen 3 backdoor or something. There's just way more ways they can have air on the river. But I think against under the gun and hijack, most spots are just harder for people to bluff in by the time they reach the river because the starting range just didn't afford as many air combos. So yeah, I'm going to guess that like this hand's a pure bluff catcher now. GTO does not like the Queen of Hearts, most probably, and therefore does a lot of folding here. Even though it looks like the hand is really far up your range, you'd have to ask yourself, well, what's a better call on the river against this sizing? 7s with a club or ace queen with the Queen of Hearts? Definitely 7s with a club, right? Because you're blocking more value combinations and you're blocking less bluffs. So it's not the case that we just want to get trapped by the thought of, God, we're really far up our range. We need to think about how useful hands are as bluff catchers, not just where they are in some kind of arbitrary hierarchy of hands.
Yeah.
Okay, next spot. So we have king 9 of spades here. We 3-bet in the small blind and button calls. So some of these hands, these haven't been marked intentionally by you, Andreas, so they may be a little bit more random or less interesting. So we have a board of 6-5-3 here and we go for a large c-bet. So what's your thought process here?
Well, on this board, I only play either checks or big bets, roughly 50-50, maybe 60-40 for betting. I don't know why I chose this particular hand to bet there. Basically, I have 2 overs. But yeah, I don't have any backdoor except for the pair back draws. But I still thought that I could get enough folds here from just random ace highs or other random hands that decided to call.
So this is a really fun spot. So in theory, this board is one of the worst ones for the small blind, right? So the small blind c-bet range here, I agree it's B60 or B66 or B50 or something like that rather than B33 if we are betting here. But what's going to happen is that if you are betting kind of indiscriminately, like if we were to node lock a strategy where you were betting range, for example, for 60% pop, not saying that's what you're doing, but if you did end up doing that and we node lock that into the solver would fold close to 0% of its range against the big bet here. It would literally stop folding. It would be like, okay, well, it's a higher EV spot for my range than for yours, so if you want to take your range and uniformly do the same action with it, none of my range goes into the muck now, even if I do have to pay. other than maybe like the Jack 10 of diamonds at like at some frequency, right? At a mixed frequency. But it would be absolutely mind-blowing how much they would continue if they knew that was your strategy, right? If you build a c-bet strategy that's a bit more GTO, what's going to happen here is that button is still going to over-defend compared to like the mathematical fold equity for the risk reward that you're creating. So if you bet 60% pot, or let's say you bet 50% pot, just for simplicity, they're meant to fold 33% of the time. They probably fold 30 or 29 in GTO or something like that. That's what in position tends to do. It just drives up the defense frequency a little bit. So in GTO, there will be a minimum standard for what you're allowed to bluff here. And it's unusual for that to apply immediately on the flop in a 3-bet pot. Normally that minimum standard for, you know, the threshold of how good a hand you need to be allowed to bluff in the first place, normally that only kicks in on the turn or something like that, because like after your opponent's filtered and called a bet, that's where it kicks in. But on especially bad boards for your range, there's actually a minimum standard when you're out of position as to what you're allowed to bet right from the flop. So here, I think there'll be some hands like Jack 10 of diamonds, for example, or Jack 10 of spades, which you're absolutely just not allowed to bet ever. A hand like King 9 of spades, this is closer to a bet, one because of the backdoor straight draw with the 9, and two because the king is a bigger card and is more often an overcard to things like jacks or 10s. But I do think that there'll be quite a harsh standard here, and I think we'd be mainly looking at bigger pair draws. This one might be alright, but bigger pair draws like King Jack, King Queen, things with backdoor hearts, things with one club, stuff like that. I think the no club to medium card hands are pure checks in GTO. That doesn't mean that I don't like your c-bet. If the GTO reaction to your strategy is to defend all of their range, it's fair to say that pool is not reacting optimally to your strategy. So I think pool is grossly overfolding here. I think when they have a hand like King Queen of diamonds, they don't understand that that's actually a call a lot of the time. And that, as you mentioned, ace high as well. So I think what you're doing here is making a play that actually dramatically overperforms compared to the theoretical expectation. So I think it's quite an okay play. Do be careful theoretically, though. There is this bar that you have to jump over with your hand strength before you're allowed to bet out of position here. Villain calls. The turn is the 9 of diamonds. And yeah, what's your thought process here? And what would you like to do?
Yeah, so I might potentially have been bailed out here, but yeah, there's no point in betting now. I'm not sure how I would react to a bet on his side now. Probably I would have to call, but yeah, definitely shutting down now that I have picked up quite some showdown value.
Okay, so if you were going to bet, would it be closer to a value bet or closer to a bluff?
Well, I mean, it would probably be called a value bet, but it would be very, very close, and this is why I don't want to bet.
What size are you imagining when you say that? You have a bet size in your mind there?
Well, because it's a 3-bet pot, we got what 1.5 SPR. I would probably bet like third pot now to get it in on the river. Not with this hand, I mean, but this would be if I were to double barrel here.
Okay, and what do you think Villain's range is like here then? Why do you think it's too pessimistic for you to value bet this hand?
Because he's got either trapping me or he's got a flush draw. He's got sevens, eights, could even be tens, possibly jacks, although he might 4-bet those pre. And then all sorts of random stuff like ace 10 of hearts or possibly ace 10 of diamonds, something like that. But I think against those, I don't need to protect too much with only one card to come. That was my idea.
What do you think your equity is at this stage of the hand before you've bet? If you had to give me a number, what would you say against Villain's range?
I'm a bit biased because I know what he has.
Right, you need to forget that. You need to completely forget that.
Well, not like probably, yeah, definitely over 50%, but it's not sky high. So like 65, something like that, 70.
Yeah, I agree with like high 60s, low 70s, definitely. And that's enough to block bet. Like, that's enough to make a small bet in GTO. So when you're out of position, the thing to understand is that checking is not very good because it doesn't close the action and it doesn't protect you from, you know, not facing a bet on that street. You're not going to have a free passage to the river here by checking. So the EV of that play is really diminished by the fact that you're out of position. What we therefore see is that there's not really a big difference between betting small and checking when you're out of position when you have hands that have between 60 and 75% equity. Actually, it's usually fine to block. So my instinct here is that both check and block are like totally fine in GTO, as long as you keep the sizing down to like 17 big blinds, 16 big blinds, something like that. When we ran through Villain's range there, I think you began to realize that maybe you'd been a bit pessimistic at first, because 7s, 8s, 4s, 5-4, ace-5, ace-4, ace-3, 9-8, 10-9 backdoor, flush draw, ace-10 missed backdoor. I'm rattling off combos here because I want to impress the audience and I want them to buy my courses, but also that's a lot of hands that we're beating, right? So I think our equity is a bit better than we thought. I think you can value bet. I wonder how much hindsight is tainting your thought process here.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that is my biggest leak, I think, the hand reading in play. I can do these things very well afterwards, but like in play, I just didn't go through all those combos. I only realized I picked up showdown equity, but I kind of still saw some monsters there. And that's why I checked, and I even said earlier, I'm not even sure if I would want to call a big bet on the turn. But yeah, now I would definitely say I was too pessimistic, yes.
Okay. And whether we call a big bet or not, that's neither here nor there. That's a separate node. We've not faced that yet. If we do face a really big bet, then I would say we've become indifferent, like our hand has been demoted to the rank of bluff catcher, and that's where we can think about folding if we think the spot's under bluffed. But for now, checking, facing a small bet, we'll have an easy value beater call or jam, depending what we think. And against the big bet, yeah, we just have to decide what we think the range composition is here. But yeah, starting with a check is not a problem. There's nothing wrong with this play, but it's definitely not like the absolute middle of your range. A hand that you would have to check here would be more something like ace king of spades or something like that, I think, or maybe like ace 5, not king 9.
Yep.
Okay, villain checks back. The ace of hearts rolls off on the river. How would you estimate your equity now? Do you have enough to block bet here, or is it too thin?
I think this is too thin now because he floats with all sorts of aces and checks them back on the turn. So I think this actually hits his range quite hard after we filtered so big on the flop. So here I'm absolutely in bluff catch territory.
Yeah, so what you're basically saying is you do not have the equity to value bet for any sizing. Bluff catch territory, again, only if we face a bet. And the reason I'm being really strict and nitpicky with this is that students tend to frequently forget that when you check, very often it goes check, check, and that's wrapped up in the EV of checking as well. But yeah, I think this would be a bit too thin. There are still hands like 10s and jacks. There are plenty of ace-x, as you allude to. And then I'm not sure people will do a great job of calling 7s, 8s, etc. even to a block bet here at the right frequency. So this might be an okay spot to like block bet bluff. I'm not so sure about like going as thin as king 9 for value here. I mean, there is 10-9 and stuff as well, and 8-9 maybe, but yeah, I think it's too thin. So we check, villain checks back, and I guess we win against 7s or 8s. Yeah, we win against 7s. Cool, so I think you played that fine, a bit too pessimistic, a little mental game leak maybe creeping in there, but yeah, definitely, I think it's okay. Also on the flop, you are deviating by making this play, I'm pretty sure. With this hand, there is more of a standard on boards that are bad for your range, just to summarize that part.
Yeah.
Okay, pocket queens now. We go for an ISO here as cutoff limps. There's a 3-bet ahead of us. We go for the 4-bet. We face the jam and we call. There's not really much to say about hands like this, but the audience likes a good sweat. Did we manage to win with a straight? I would think so. Got him. Ace-6 now in the big blind. We peel the hijack open. Ace, ace, queen. We check call the flop. 5 on the turn. B75 from villain. Looks like a reluctant but not that miserable check call. Just sort of see what happens. River the boat and face this. Yeah, interesting spot. So, your thought process?
Yeah, I think I actually, I'm not sure on this one in hindsight. So I thought he is doing this, well, either as a complete bluff or he's got a good ace and he might have ace queen, then good for him. But I thought, like, if he has ace king, ace jack, even ace 10 would play it like that. So now the question was, obviously I'm raising here, and I thought for a long time what to do, and I decided to go for gold here, which I think if he's got ace king, he will have to call this off, and even ace jack or so. Although I, yeah, I'm not sure, because he has a very polarized triple barreling range here. But I think that ace king and ace jack are still part of the polarized betting range, and I think most players cannot fold ace king or ace jack on such a board. And on top of that, there are more combinations of ace king and ace jack than there are of ace queen.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analysis. I'd say there's a couple of things missing from it. What other value combos that have to bet call here do you also beat, other than ace king and ace jack?
Pocket queens.
Good.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Pocket queens, ace 5, and maybe pocket 5s as well. So there's actually a few more combos than you're even listing there. So yeah, I think jam is the only play. To put this into perspective for people, I think there's a lot of like misunderstanding about raise sizing that goes on in general. What we need to think about when we're raising is not the X villain's bet we're making it, not how many times their bet we're making it, but actually what size our bet is into the new pot that is created after we called this bet. A raise is a bet plus is a call plus a new bet. So when we call this 13, the pot would become 26 plus 19, 54? And then, is my math right there? 54, yeah, 26 plus 19.
6, yeah.
44?
No, 44,
yeah. Sometimes I just like randomly add 10 to stuff when I'm doing math. So 44, and then we're making it like not that much of an overbet. We're making it how much more for villain to call here, like 80, something like that. So we're going like 70, so we're going just under 2x pot, it looks like.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's okay, because like when your jamming range is massively powerful boats, just under 2x pot is a pretty reasonable size to make it. If we're a bit deeper here, if we're like 160 big blinds deep or something like that, now you could start to ask, hold on a minute, am I actually just making villain fold way too many trips combos? Am I actually getting it in only against ace, queen, and queens or something like that, which would not be very good for you at all? And then we could maybe argue that very deep here, jam becomes a polarization mistake where we're quote unquote overplaying the hand. But I think at the stack depth, jam is the right sizing. I don't think there's really much argument, because when you have massive equity, leaving money on the table is not a good thing. And here's another thought process. If you made it 56 and villain jammed, would you ever have the mental fortitude to fold? Would you ever like be able to put them on just the range of ace queen?
Not.
So we're not saving anything when beat by making it smaller. We are just winning less against hands like queens though, right? So jam is absolutely correct here. Don't have monsters under the bed, and definitely avoid a thought process such as, but what's he gonna call with? It's too scary. Like, yeah, people might fold ace jack here, but they might not. And I think this is actually a really underfolded or badly played spot, I want to say, because the psychological attachment to this hand when you have ace king here is really strong. And that lays down the gauntlet for a human, in that it's going to be very difficult for the human to overcome that. In reality, if hijack has ace king here, they will lose 95% of the time in this pool that they call this
I was
raise.
just going to say, like, what bluffs do I have there?
None. Like, nobody has any bluffs here, but still the magnetism is too strong for many players, and that's what we have to understand. It's never about what they should do, it's always about what they actually do. Okay, pocket ace is now in the small blind, so we go for 3-bet against under the gun. Under the gun makes the call. The flop comes king of hearts, jack of diamonds, 7 of diamonds, and we go for a small bet, which I like. Villain min raises. Interesting. So this is the first decision point. What do we make of this player type? What do we make of this range? And what do we want to do about it?
Yeah, so at this point, I didn't know the player at all. It's, yeah, I mean, min clicking normally is a sign of strength. But here, like, yeah, I could do it with a set or king jack, basically, for value. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe he's a random clicker and does it with diamonds as well or so. I think he shouldn't have a lot of min clicks there in GTO and in position. Like I can't see any. Like yeah, that confused me.
Okay, so I would add a few more adjectives to this range before I add any combos. Let's outline the range broadly using the thicker paintbrush of language, and then we'll come in and fill it in with a few combinatoric assumptions or estimates. So I think what's going on here is that this is definitely a recreational player, right? There's no reg in the world that min raises the flop here. It's very rare. I'm not okay. It's possible, but it's still really rare. And again, we should think about who does certain things, not whether things would be good or bad to do, but who actually does them empirically. Fish do this, right? So this is probably a weaker player. Okay, what's a weaker player's range like for doing this? The main adjective that comes to mind here, for me, begins with an M, and that is, any guesses, audience? Pause the video. What's villain's range here? Any guesses from you, Andreas?
M?
Starts with an M, yeah, this word I'm thinking about. Some of the audience know, some don't.
Oh yeah, merged. Yeah.
Good, merged is right. We did not pause the video there for Andreas to figure that out. Andreas, you got it. 5 seconds, not bad. So yeah, merged is the correct answer to anybody watching this who got that. Well done. Weaker players, they don't have the definition of polarization that they're meant to have. So you're not going to see them understand that it's not necessarily a great idea to reopen the action here with King 9 or with Ace Jack. So I would add a bunch more hands to villain's range, like King 9, King 10, Ace Jack, Ace Queen, Queen 10, 10 9. The list goes on. Some diamond hands, some King X plus diamond for sure. Let me put it to you this way. I don't think there are many low EV bluffs in villain's range here. I don't think there are many low equity hands. I don't think there are any like pocket fives that are just waiting to lose their shit. Yeah. If he'd raised bigger, I might be like, well, okay, now he might be like kind of crazy and might just have like a bunch of random things. But I think this sizing is usually just a merged range. If we're not going to save money later here on blank runouts, like if the turn is a 5 and we check and villain bets that we're going to jam anyway, I wonder if it's just better for us to 3-bet the flop immediately, get a bit of denial, get more money in against King X, against draws, against pair plus draw immediately. Yeah, my main ambition here is certainly not to save my stack against a recreational player. That's the last thing I care about here. I'm more just thinking, well, how do I maximize my EV the times I'm ahead? And because of the mergedness of villain's range, because of the lack of polarization, and because of the lack of really low EV bluffs, I think I'm just 3-betting the flop.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I thought I was overthinking it because I had the ace of diamonds. I thought he's less likely to have the nut flush draw there. So I didn't really see that low equity bluff thing. I didn't think about that, but makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there are any no equity bluffs. Let me put it that way. I think if this is a bluff, it's like double gutter 10-9, it's like queen 10, it's like hands that have to continue to a 3-bet anyway and are unlikely to go nuts if you just call. If you just call here, you're going to check the turn. The urgency is actually really high when you're facing a raise or bet out of position because you're going to procedurally check the villain on the next street. It can go check, check, and you wind up on a 4 straight river or some board that you can't value bet. Villain shows down ace jack and you win no more money. I think we need to be pretty greedy here. We need to be kind of hungry and we need to be willing to say, okay, if we're beat, we're beat. We're probably not escaping from it on many nodes anyway or many parts of the game tree. So why don't we maximize the times that we're running into high equity draws, top pair, pair plus draw, and general fish nonsense merges. Ace king, by the way, can also very much be in this range. Fish are not a fan of the preflop 4-bet. So player type is derived from line, and then our action is derived from understanding the range of that player type. That's how we're going about this. So I actually would prefer a 3-bet here.
Yeah, makes sense.
Check, check. River 8. Yeah, what do we think of villain's range at this point?
Well, I mean, there is a chance that he still has a jack and just is trapping, although I would discount that. I think now it's either a draw. He had a draw on the flop, or most likely I would say a king or something like queens even.
Okay, and what do we want to do about that? I like the hand reading. What do we do about it?
Then we have to bet against that range because he's not gonna it's unlikely that he'll bet, especially queens. And a king, yeah, if he has ace king, he might bet it, but he'll call that anyway. So
Exactly.
I prefer to bet here.
Cool. So yeah, I think a big part of this is that many of the hands that villain was actually bluffing with on the flop, they're quite unlikely to reignite the river because of villain's sizing. So villain's sizing really does denote a player type that's a bit more passive and a bit more like clicky, rather than like a raging bull that's trying to like force you out of the pot. If villain was the raging bull kind of player, it's very likely that they bet the turn at a high frequency. Therefore, deductively, the mere fact that they haven't bet the turn is decreasing the frequency that they are the raging bull. Therefore, their range is really king x heavy here. I expect to see king queen at a very high cognitive frequency, meaning that villain is very likely to take the combos of king queen and en masse put them into this exact action sequence. Whereas with a jack, while it's possible, they're not going to be... The jack x combos are not all going to land in the range after this action sequence. Most of them are going to bet the turn or not raise the flop or whatever. So yeah, I would say that this is really frequently something like queens, king queen, ace king, maybe even like a lower pair, like a 7 or like 9s or something. I'm a big fan of betting into this merged, condensed, mostly capped range. If you do get jammed on, it's going to be disgusting, and probably villain has a ton of 10-9 and slow plays, and you should probably bet fold here, honestly, for about 3/4 pot, 2/3 pot, something like that. We go for the jam. Yeah, okay, that's okay. It's certainly a bit thinner, but I don't hate it. I definitely don't hate it.
Well, my idea was, but I probably gave him too much credit because I was thinking I have the ace of diamonds here, so it's unlikely that he has diamonds. And because diamonds missed, if he has ace king, he can't get away from it. That was my thinking in the moment.
So your thinking is definitely, it definitely has undertones of someone that has played a lot of live poker, because it's quite specific and it's quite it follows a narrative. It's like, if he has this, he will think this because of this, and then this will happen. It's kind of like telling a story, and the story it's telling is probably dead right about that part of the game tree. The reason this kind of thought process can be problematic is that it's a little bit tunnel vision-y. It puts the blinkers on to some extent, and it does miss out on other parts of the range here. So remember that you are running into a jack sometimes, you're running into like 10-9 sometimes and stuff like that. Like, you can lose here. I do think you've got a really big equity hand. I think the jam is probably fine. My instinct was to bet a bit smaller than this, but yeah, do you know what? I don't hate it. I would just say, with the specificity of your thought process, don't just focus on when villain has ace king. There are other hands in there as well, but I'm not a fan of trying to get called at all costs. I'm definitely not a fan of being like, oh, let's pick the size that queens will call, because one, we don't know what that is, and two, why are we trying to maximize the frequency we're called at instead of the magnitude of the pot we win? The latter is what matters to EV the most in theory, so I'm all for focusing on that. And we talk about this in grade 2 lecture 6, the in position game is what that lecture is called, and in that we talk about like tripling the river, betting 3x pot, things like that, how to get the most EV with the absolute top of your range, and that is by maximizing the size of the pot that you win, not the frequency you're called at. And that is the concept that's relevant here. So I don't mind this at all. I just would say, let's hand read a little bit more broadly. I think your amount of focus on the ace of diamonds here, it's a little bit visual. I think, like, you're looking at that and you're bringing it into your thought process repeatedly, but like, I don't really care, because if villain had a busted diamond draw, there's no sizing they're really calling anyway, so it doesn't really matter to me unless I'm going to check and slow play. But even if I didn't have the ace of diamonds, I still wouldn't check and slow play here. I wouldn't. There's not enough chance of villain bluffing the river as played after this line, so I don't really care about the ace of diamonds. I don't think it deserves to be part of the narrative in the way that you're making it part of it. I don't think it deserves prime central stage in your thought process. I don't think it deserves the spotlight that you're giving it, basically. I think you can be a bit more broad about the hand reading. I don't know what's better here, B75 or jam. They're both probably quite similar. Maybe jam is better, but yeah, I think we just adjust our hand reading there and zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture. All right, Andreas, how have you found your one-off exclusive coaching session at Carrot Corner?
Yeah, definitely very helpful. I mean, I've watched a few of these before and they were always very interesting, but if you really played the hands yourself, I think it is very interesting, because often when you just watch them, you kind of trick yourself into thinking, oh yeah, I would probably have done the same thing. But here, really getting your opinion on it is, yeah, it was very helpful. And on spots that I thought were kind of trivial, you did give a new put a new light on them that actually was very helpful. Yeah, so thank you very much.
Good. What are your poker plans going forward? Do you have any ambitions in the game? Where would you like to get to in your poker career?
Well, I definitely want to continue with a live poker. That is my bread and butter game. Just playing. I'm at the moment I'm playing a lot of 1-3 and 2-5. So I want to just extend that and get the hours in. But also, like for me, I treat online poker as a training almost for live poker. I just want to become much better theory wise, and that I've already made quite a few progress there, but yeah, definitely want to become much more solid in terms of hand reading and theory in general. And then, yeah, the plan is to crush 2-5 live.
Nice. That could be the name of your next book, Crush 25 Live. It's a good one. It's
Yeah.
catchy. Well, I'm pleasantly surprised by your level. And I mean that I don't want to offend like everybody out there. Like he expects us all to be massive fish, but usually when a player comes to me with a live background, I expect them to be not as good as a player with an online background. But as you say, you train online. I think your hand reading is good. You have a really good like implicit awareness of theory. You're following everything I'm saying. As the audience can probably tell, I pitched this session on quite a high level of proficiency. You know, I'm using concepts that I wouldn't use with other students. That's what you'll notice with coaching. A good coach will always pitch the level of the lesson to the student. And with you, Andreas, I felt like I could really go into a lot of detail and get you to answer questions with the faith that I wasn't just putting you into like a really confused, lost state, and that you would be able to come up with the answers. So yeah, I think you will crush 2-5 live. I think you're already in a place where you could do that from your skill level. Keep grinding live, keep practicing online, and I wish you all of the success in your media roles as an author and everything else you're doing in the poker world. And again, for the audience's benefit, we have your book. Just remind us one more time of the title of that.
Yeah, the London Poker Guide.
London Poker Guide. So if you're playing poker in the UK, you're thinking about how to get the most out of that, do check it out. There's an interview in there that I did, as we said at the start of this. All right, guys, so you know what to do. It's carrotcorner.com for all of the content from me, and we will see you soon for another video. Andreas, thank you very much for doing this. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much. Likewise.
All right, bye for now, guys.